I consider Doctor Who's The Crusade to be a relatively solid historical. The thing that really holds it back is, well, for one thing, I don't know. Some people might have contention with the prospect that this serial is glorifying the Crusades. I don't see it as that per se. Perhaps there isn't much of a attempt to, acknowledge that the Crusades were kind of horrible, I suppose, but, look, this is belonging to a tradition wherein England had a reverence of at least the Third Crusade, the Richard the Lionheart era. It's what he was doing whilst Robin Hood was fighting John and all that. So, there's a certain appreciation, perhaps false and kind of wrong, very wrong, that the English have for the Third Crusade. And that's where this is set. We have Julian Glover portraying Richard the Lionheart. Julian Glover would later portray the villain in City of Death. I don't remember his name right now, but that's just a very memorable serial and role. The other thing that this serial has against its name is the fact that 2 of its episodes are missing, 2 and 4. So therefore, it can be a bit hard to assess the overall quality of the 4 episodes as a connected piece, really. To those who don't know, it's worth discussing what the Crusades were, and I might not be the best person to do this. Neither is Wikipedia, but we'll read off of them anyway. There are more appropriate university sources just to read into, if you are so inclined. The Crusades are a series of religious wars initiated, supported, and sometimes directed by the Latin Church in the medieval period. The best known of these military expeditions are those to the Holy Land in the period between 1095 and 1291 that were intended to conquer Jerusalem and its surrounding area from Islamic rule. Beginning of the First Crusade, which resulted in the recovery of Jerusalem in 1099, dozens of military campaigns have been organized, providing a focal point of European history for centuries and later for historians worldwide. Crusading declined rapidly during the 16th century with the advent of the Protestant Reformation. Yeah, it's important to know at one time in history, the Crusades have had a very long, lasting impact on the cultural memory regarding the Holy Land. Well, what we know today is Israel/Palestine. It is relevant. You see, at one time, the Holy Land was naturally, as you imagine, given the dominance of Christianity at one time, and it was a sacred site to them, and they occupied it, and obviously there were some Jews there as well, because it was a sacred site to Judaism. Eventually, given the dominance of Islam in the Middle East, it was only the caliphates, it was only inevitable that they would take the area of, the Palestina area, what was once, called Roman Judea, some of those famous geographical locations of all time, possibly. And then so this dispute over who actually owns that territory, this is war between whichever Islamic empire is in power in the Mideast at that time, and the Latin Church, the European powers, France, Germany, England, whomever. The conflict over this probably just cursed at this point, land is it's been going on for centuries. It is insane. Anyway, in 1095, this is how it began. Pope Urban II proclaimed the first expedition at the Council of Clermont. He encouraged military support for Byzantine Emperor Alexios I against the Seljuk Turks and called for an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Across all social strata in Western Europe, there was an enthusiastic response. Participants came from all over Europe, from all social strata, and had a variety of motivations, including religious salvation, satisfying feudal obligations, opportunities for renown, and economical political advantage. Later expeditions were conducted by generally more organized armies, sometimes led by a king. It's important to remember, people literally believed in their religion at that time. There was no doubting the word of God, or in according to a sacred text, or how it was interpreted by the... Well, obviously, you're a serf, you can't read Latin, so this is all being told to you by the clergy. Excuse me. All were granted papal indulgences. Oh, I also mentioned... So you took all of this religious worldview seriously, but you never actually witnessed... But the world was very mundane, ugly, bloody, kind of smelly, wasn't it? Yeah, imagine just medieval Europe. Not a very pleasant time. You kind of wonder, gee, is there a God? Well, the clergy says there is, But how come there's no immaculate, amazing miracles like we hear about in the Old Testament, New Testament? What happened to them? This is something that fringe groups of Christianity believe today. Where are the miracles? Where are these fantastic occurrences which people in the time of the Bible seem to borderline expect? Well, they figured, oh well, it'll definitely come. Well, the Crusades, like this call, rally cry, this call to arms. This is it. We'll see, Christ will come again in the Holy Land once we reclaim it from the Muslims. That's probably what they thought. So certain extremist groups think now in regard to, who doesn't own Israel / Palestine / Judea / whatever. Anyway, where were we? All were granted papal indulgences. Oh, you don't know what those are? You used to... This is part why the Protestant Reformation came about. You used to be able to pay the church to kind of absolve you of your sins, assure you a place in heaven. Things had been corrupted since the early church, let's say. As someone who remains a lapsed Catholic, it's unfortunate how things were. Initial successes established 4 Latin states: the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the county of Tripoli. European presence remained in the region to some form until the fall of Acre in 1291. After this, no further large military campaigns have been organised to conquer the Holy Land. Concurrent military activities in the Iberian Peninsula against the Moors and in northeastern Europe against the West Slav, Baltic and Finnic peoples, the Northern Crusades, have originally been called Crusades. Later, the campaigns in the Middle East have been given the same name, retroactively long after the event had ended, due to the fact that they had central approval by the Roman Catholic Church and that the military campaigns were organised in comparable fashion, with often similar rhetoric, symbolism and banners, as applied to during the campaigns in Spain. Oh, yeah. Of course, for a time here, Spain, Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula is occupied by the Muslims, and the Spanish have a reconquista, and eventually they were driven back to Northern Africa. Where are we at? Other church-sanctioned campaigns called Crusades were fought against Christian communities not obeying papal ruling, precursors of proto-Protestantism. This is them burning the Gnostics and such. Oh, and the Albigensian Crusade. That's a very brutal instance in history. Against the Ottoman Empire and for political reasons, unsanctioned by the church, there were also several popular crusades. There's also the Children's Crusade, as outlined in, for example, it sounds like a sick Monty Python sketch, but it's true. It's outlined in Andre Vida's film, for example, Gates of Paradise, which we've discussed on this channel before. The struggle between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula was proclaimed a crusade in 1123, but eventually became better known as the Reconquista in European historiography, and only ended in 1492 with the fall of the Muslim Emirate of Granada. From 1147, campaigns in northern Europe against pagan tribes were considered crusades. In 1199, Pope Innocent III began the practice of proclaiming crusades against apostate Christian communities, called heretics by the Latin Church. In the 13th century, crusading was used against the Cathars in Languedoc and against Bosnia. This practice continued against the Waldengians in Savoy and the Hussites in Bohemia in the 15th century and against Protestants in the 16th. If you want an absolutely brilliant short story about orthodoxy and trying to establish a firm canon within a religion's theology, read Borges' The Theologians. I've done an audiobook of it, but you might be better off reading it. It's one of the great short stories you will ever read, I'm quite certain. From the mid-14th century, crusading rhetoric was used in response to the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and ended around 1699 with the War of the Holy League. The Crusades and their excesses constituted a controversial chapter in the history of Latin Christianity. And now I'll just read out information regarding the conception and writing, and then we'll be done for this day. After departing his role as Doctor Who's story editor in October 1964, David Whitaker moved into freelance work. He was immediately commissioned to write the 2-part Doctor Who serial The Rescue to begin the show's second production block. On the 1st of November 1964, producer Verity Lambert commissioned Whitaker to write a 4-part historical serial to balance his science fiction stories. The scripts are developed by the 15th of January 1965, entitled Doctor Who and the Crusades. Working titles for the serial include Doctor Who and the Saracen Hordes and the Lionheart. The Third Crusade is a historical setting that had fascinated Whitaker. He found that some of the historical figures, namely King Richard and his sister Joan, whose affectionate relationship he considered almost incestuous in its intensity, were effective material for a character drama. Depictions of the sexual relationship between the siblings were cut from the script, probably good, partly as Hartnell found it unsuitable for the family show. I'll say Glover was disappointed by their removal. Well, it's a kid show. Don't have you wouldn't suggest too much sexual relationship between any two characters in this show at that time. Certainly not between siblings. That ought to have been cut. I agree. The serial depicts two historical events: King Richard's attempt at peace by offering his sister in marriage to Saladin's brother Safaddin in October 1191, and the ambush of King Richard near Jaffa in November 1191. The timing of the events were rearranged for dramatic purposes. Story editor Dennis Spooner was impressed by the maturity and near-Shakespearean nature of Whitaker's scripts. Douglas Camfield was assigned to direct The Crusade, having worked as a production assistant on earlier serials An Unearthly Child 1963 and Marco Polo 1964, and proven himself a capable director of the third episode of Planet of Giants 1964. Absolutely was. Hill enjoyed working with Camfield again, and O'Brien, who was newer to the series, found him dynamic. Hartnell was pleased to work with a director he liked. Hey, Hartnell liked him. That's terrific. Camfield praised Whitaker's writing and research, declaring the serial the best Doctor Who script I've ever worked on. I don't think it was the best one he ever worked on. Maybe it's probably the Web of Fear or one of those ones, but whatever. Barry Newbury worked on the serial set design. He used a 1962 volume Behind the Veil of Arabia by Jürgen Bisch for inspiration. The images of the original architecture from the Crusades were particularly useful for Newbury. The props adorning the sets were hired from Old Times Props House. Camfield engaged Dudley Simpson, who had previously scored Planet of Giants, to compose the incidental music of The Crusade. 9 minutes of music was recorded on the 1st of March 1965, performed by 5 musicians on a range of instruments. The Crusade was the last collaboration between Camfield and Simpson. A falling out between the two shortly after the serial's airing led to Camfield's refusal to hire Simpson. When he became aware that he had misjudged Simpson many years later, Camfield intended to hire him again, but died before doing so. The serial used sound effects extensively. Oh, gee, what was their falling out about? That's a shame. Oh well. We'll end it here. This has been a longer one. Thanks you so very much, my beautiful friends. Tune in next time if you're so inclined to part 2 of Doctor Who's The Crusade, where we'll be discussing the missing episode. So maybe you ought to have saved the discussion of history for that one, hey.